My wife finally got pregnant, but it came at a cost. The hardest part about waiting was the emptiness. It wasn't just the physical stillness, it was the kind of hollowness that wraps around you like a heavy blanket, squeezing the air out of your lungs. Each second dragged endlessly, stretching minutes into what felt like hours. I sat next to Emily in the clinic's waiting room, the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead adding to the oppressive silence. Emily, my wife, sat stiffly by my side, her hands clenched in her lap, her knuckles white from the tension. The toll of the last few years was etched deeply into her face. Every line spoke of the sleepless nights, the dashed hopes, and the unspoken fears we carried together. We'd been trying for nearly 3 years to have a baby. 3 long, grueling years filled with countless doctor visits, invasive tests, and heartbreaking disappointments. There were moments when we considered giving up, accepting that maybe this wasn't in the cards for us. But hope, relentless and stubborn, always pulled us back. No matter how many times we told ourselves we'd had enough, it would creep in again, pushing us to try one more time. That hope, or maybe desperation, had led us to Dr. Edward Palmer, a fertility specialist working out of an obscure clinic just outside Boston. The clinic was tucked away in a part of the city that felt like it had been forgotten by progress. The building was old, red brick with ivy creeping up its walls, and the narrow windows gave it a strange, watchful quality, like a pair of eyes that missed nothing. It felt out of place, sitting among the sleek glass towers of the financial district, but in a way, it mirrored how Emily and I felt, isolated, out of step with the rest of the world. We'd heard about Dr. Palmer from a close friend, someone who had once walked the same path we were on now. She had struggled for years to conceive and finally succeeded at this very clinic. I remember the way her voice took on a peculiar edge when she spoke about him. "He's not like the other doctors," she said, leaning forward like she was sharing a secret too big for the room. "Dr. Palmer doesn't give up, and he doesn't fail. If anyone can help you, it's him." Her words stuck with me, even though I wasn't sure if I believed them. Desperation outweighed doubt, and we booked an appointment. Now here we were, sitting in that dimly lit waiting room, our hopes hanging by a thread. Emily shifted in her seat, picking at the sleeve of her sweater, her anxiety practically radiating off her. It mirrored my own unease. There was something about this place that set my nerves on edge, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The door to the back rooms creaked open, and Dr. Palmer stepped out. He was tall, with neatly combed gray hair and thin wire-rimmed glasses that caught the light just so. His smile was polite, almost practiced, and it didn't quite reach his eyes. He gestured for us to follow him, and we did. The consultation room was as outdated as the waiting area, with faded wallpaper and creaky wooden furniture that looked like it had been around since the 70s. Dr. Palmer wasted no time with small talk. He sat behind his desk, his hands folded neatly in front of him, and invited us to explain our situation. "We've been trying for 3 years," Emily began, her voice soft and weary. "We've done everything, medications, treatments, even IVF, but nothing's worked." Dr. Palmer nodded, his expression calm, as though he'd heard this story countless times before. "And now you've come to me," he said simply. I cleared my throat and jumped in. "A friend told us you're a specialist. That you help couples who've tried everything else." Leaning back in his chair, Dr. Palmer steepled his fingers and regarded us with a cool, analytical look. "That's true," he said. "I use methods that most other doctors won't even consider. My techniques are unconventional, some might say experimental, but they've yielded incredible results." He paused for a moment, his words deliberate. "Of course, with any experimental approach, there are inherent risks. But in my professional opinion, those risks are outweighed by the potential for success." My heartbeat quickened, each word sinking in. "Risks?" Dr. Palmer waved a hand dismissively. "Every medical procedure comes with risks, Mr. Chris," I said. "And this is Emily." "Well, Chris," he continued smoothly, "the risks are usually minor, things like fatigue, nausea, or general discomfort." He paused, his expression unreadable. "In rare cases, pregnancy can trigger unusual reactions in the body. But don't worry. With the proper care, everything is manageable. Something about the way he phrased it sent a chill up my spine, but before I could say anything, Emily's hand slipped into mine. She squeezed it tightly, her eyes filled with quiet determination. She wanted this more than anything. Truthfully, so did I. We'd been through too much to give up now. After a long, weighted silence, I nodded. What do we need to do? Dr. Palmer's lips curved into a smile, but there was something unsettling about it, something that didn't quite reach his eyes. Just leave everything to me, he said. We signed the papers that day, putting our faith in a man we hardly knew. Desperation can do strange things to a person, clouding their judgment and making them cling to any shred of hope. We agreed to the treatments, letting hope override caution. The treatments started immediately. They were unlike anything we had ever experienced before. The medications were stronger, the injections more frequent and intense. But Dr. Palmer assured us that it was all part of the process. At first, it seemed like he was right. Emily's body responded to the treatments faster than we'd ever seen. Within weeks, we received the news we'd been praying for: she was pregnant. The first few months were a whirlwind of cautious joy. For the first time in years, Emily looked radiant, her happiness shining through in a way I hadn't seen in ages. The nausea and fatigue seemed like a small price to pay for what we had gained. But things began to change. It started with the rash. One morning, as I was getting ready for work, Emily called me from the bedroom. There was something in her voice, an edge of worry that I couldn't ignore. I rushed to her side and found her standing in front of the mirror, her shirt lifted to reveal her growing belly. At first, I didn't see it. But as she turned slightly, my stomach sank. Beneath the surface of her skin, a faint web of veins spread out from her navel. They were dark, almost bluish, and far more visible than they should have been. It looked like something out of a medical journal, the kind of image that makes your stomach churn. It itches, she said quietly, her fingers hovering just above the skin. She didn't dare touch it. I tried to mask my concern, my mind racing through possible explanations. Hormones? Stretch marks? An allergic reaction? It's probably nothing, I said, forcing confidence into my voice. But let's call Dr. Palmer to be sure. When we called the clinic, the nurse on the other end dismissed it almost immediately. It's a normal side effect, she said flatly, as though she had repeated the phrase 100 times before. But it didn't feel normal. In the days that followed, the veins darkened and spread further. They began creeping up Emily's sides, wrapping around her back, until her torso looked like a map drawn in dark lines. And the itching, she said it was unbearable. Dr. Palmer reassured us again. Some patients experience more visible side effects than others, he explained with a calm, clinical tone. It's just a reaction to the medication. It will pass. But it didn't pass. The symptoms only worsened. Emily began to experience sharp, stabbing pains that came out of nowhere. They started in her abdomen but soon spread to her arms, legs, and even her chest. Sometimes the pain was so intense she'd double over, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in agony. At night, I'd wake to find her sitting on the edge of the bed, her hands pressed against her belly, her eyes wide and unblinking. It feels like something's moving, she whispered one night, her voice trembling. I tried to comfort her, tried to tell her it was normal for the baby to shift and kick, but deep down, I couldn't shake the unease building inside me. Something wasn't right. I could feel it in my gut, and the unshakable sense of dread that had taken root in my chest. But we were in too deep to turn back now. We had already committed. Every time I called the clinic, trying to convey my growing fears, I was met with the same sterile, detached responses. Their calmness only fueled my unease. One night, around the 5th month of Emily's pregnancy, she woke me in a panic. I could hear her labored, uneven breaths before I even opened my eyes. When I sat up, I saw her standing in front of the full-length mirror on the other side of our room, illuminated by the pale glow of moonlight seeping through the curtains. Shadows stretched across her figure, but even in the dim light, I could see the changes in her body, and they weren't normal. Her belly was grotesquely large, far too big for just 5 months alone. The veins that had started as faint lines beneath her skin were now thick, dark cords, twisting and branching like a black web across her torso. Her skin had taken on an eerie, almost translucent appearance, and beneath the surface, I could swear I saw something move. It wasn't just the gentle shifts of a baby, it was something more, something unnatural. Emily's hands hovered over her belly, trembling. Her voice was barely audible, strained and on the verge of breaking. "Chris," she whispered, "it's not just the baby. There's something else. I can feel it, it's moving differently. It's not right." My chest tightened, fear clawing at the edges of my mind. Every rational thought told me to dismiss it, to chalk it up to hormones, anxiety, or even exhaustion. But I couldn't. Deep down, I knew she was right. Something was horribly wrong. I got out of bed, crossing the room to her, and wrapped my arms around her trembling shoulders. Her skin was ice cold, slick with sweat. I whispered as softly as I could, "We'll go to the clinic tomorrow. We'll make them listen, make them do something." She nodded stiffly, her body rigid against mine. But I could feel her doubt, it mirrored my own. That night neither of us slept. I sat upright, staring at the ceiling while listening to Emily's shallow, uneven breathing. Her hand rested protectively over her distended belly, and I couldn't shake the gnawing fear growing inside me. The next morning, I demanded an emergency appointment at the clinic. Emily was too weak to argue. She was deteriorating before my eyes, her energy draining away with each passing hour. By the time we arrived, her steps were slow and labored. Dr. Palmer was waiting for us, calm and composed as always. His cool demeanor felt even more unsettling now. He ushered us into a private exam room that smelled of antiseptic and metal. The silence in the room was suffocating, the kind that made every small sound echo. "We'll run some tests," Dr. Palmer said in his smooth, clinical tone. "Everything is progressing as expected." I couldn't hold back anymore. Weeks of bottled-up frustration and fear boiled over, and my voice came out louder than I intended. "Expected?" I shouted, the words almost shaking. "Look at her! This is not normal! She's in pain, she's dying!" Dr. Palmer didn't flinch. His icy gaze stayed locked on mine, unnervingly calm. "I understand your concern, Mr. Chris," he said evenly. "But I assure you, everything is under control." "No," I snapped, shaking my head, my fists clenched. "It's not under control. You've been lying to us. You've been keeping things from us. I want the truth, now." For the first time, his mask slipped. It wasn't much, just a flicker of something dark in his eyes and a slight tightening of his jaw. His gaze flicked to Emily, who lay on the examination table, her breast shallow and her face pale, before returning to me. "There are things you don't understand," he said, his words slow and deliberate. "The treatment you agreed to, it's not just about fertility. It's about something much greater." A chill ran down my spine. "What the hell are you talking about?" Dr. Palmer stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial whisper. "We're on the brink of a monumental breakthrough, Mr. Chris. A discovery that will redefine what it means to be human. Your child, Emily's child, isn't just a baby. It's the first step in a new evolution, the future of humanity." I stared at him, my mind struggling to process the magnitude of his words. "You're experimenting on us?" I shouted, my voice shaking with rage and disbelief. Dr. Palmer didn't even flinch. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculated smile that sent a chill through my entire body. "Your child isn't just a child, Mr. Chris," he said evenly. "It's a breakthrough. A new step forward in evolution. Something beyond anything we've ever known." I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. My chest tightened, and my heartbeat roared in my ears. "You're insane," I said, my voice cracking. "You've put something in her, something that's not human." Dr. Palmer's smile grew wider, more sinister. "Not yet," he said, his voice disturbingly calm. "But it will be." Before I could react, the door opened, and 2 nurses walked in. Their faces were blank, devoid of emotion, like they were machines carrying out a program. Without hesitation, they moved toward Emily, who was too weak to resist, and began preparing her for some kind of procedure. "No!" I shouted, surging toward the table. "Don't touch her!" One of the nurses grabbed my arm with a grip that was shockingly strong. "Sir, step back," she said in an eerily monotone voice. "Let me go!" I yelled, thrashing against her hold. My panic rose with every passing second, my desperation mounting. Dr. Palmer stood calmly in the corner, his hands folded behind his back, watching the scene unfold with an unsettling detachment. "You need to trust me, Mr. Chris," he said. "Everything I'm doing is for the greater good." "Greater good?" I spat, my voice trembling with anger. "You're killing her!" Before I could say another word, I felt a sharp prick in my arm. One of the nurses had injected me with something. My vision blurred instantly, the edges of the room swimming as my body grew sluggish and heavy. I tried to fight it, forcing myself to stay conscious, but the darkness was relentless. My limbs went limp, and the world faded into nothingness. When I woke, the room was dim, illuminated only by the glow of medical equipment. My body felt like it had been weighed down with cement, every movement slow and labored. Panic surged through me as I realized I was strapped to a chair, thick leather restraints binding my wrists and ankles. Across the room, Emily lay on the examination table, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. Her skin was almost translucent now, and the veins that had spread across her body were as dark as ink. Her belly had swollen even more, grotesquely large, as if something enormous was struggling to break free from inside her. Dr. Palmer stood beside her, observing her like she was a specimen under a microscope. His expression was one of quiet satisfaction, the detached gaze of a man who had achieved exactly what he wanted. The nurses were gone, and the room was eerily silent aside from the soft beeping of the machines monitoring Emily's vitals. "She's nearing the final stage," Dr. Palmer said softly, almost as though he were talking to himself. "It's almost time." My throat was dry, but I managed to croak out, "Time for what?" Dr. Palmer glanced at me, his brow lifting slightly as though surprised I could still speak. "For the birth, of course," he said, his tone disturbingly casual. "The culmination of my work. Your child, Mr. Chris, will be the first of many. The dawn of a new era." "No," I gasped, struggling against the restraints with every ounce of strength I had. "You can't do this. You're playing God, and you're going to kill her." "She's a vessel," he replied coldly, as if those words justified everything. "A means to an end. Emily accepted this, even if she didn't fully understand." Tears burned in my eyes, blurring my vision as rage and helplessness consumed me. I had trusted him. I had brought her here. And now, I was watching her die. Suddenly, Emily's body convulsed violently. Her back arched off the table as a guttural scream tore from her throat. The machines around her erupted in a frenzy of beeps, their monitors flashing erratically. Dr. Palmer moved quickly, adjusting the equipment with a calm efficiency that made my stomach churn. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting this. "It's happening," he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. I could only watch in horror as Emily's swollen belly bulged and shifted unnaturally. The skin stretched grotesquely, rippling and distorting as something large moved beneath the surface. Her screams echoed off the walls, raw and piercing, and all I could do was beg. "Please," I sobbed, my voice breaking. "Stop it. Please stop it." Dr. Palmer didn't even glance at me. His attention remained locked on Emily, on the horrifying transformation unfolding in front of us. Suddenly, her convulsions stopped. The room fell into an unsettling stillness, broken only by the faint, rhythmic beeping of the machines. Emily lay motionless on the table, her chest barely rising and falling, her once radiant skin now drained of all color. For a fleeting moment I thought she was gone, that whatever nightmare had gripped her had finally taken her life. But then I saw it. A subtle movement at first, almost imperceptible. Her belly rippled unnaturally, the skin stretching in ways it wasn't meant to. Then something pushed outward from within, pressing against her abdomen. I could see it, the shape of fingers, of an arm, of something far too large and too alien to belong to a human baby. My breath caught in my throat as the horrific realization struck me: this thing wasn't waiting. It was coming. Dr. Palmer stepped forward, his expression alight with a grotesque mixture of awe and anticipation. "This is it," he murmured reverently. "The birth of the future." Emily's body twitched violently, her back arching one final time before the grotesque culmination began. With a sickening, wet tearing sound, her stomach split open. From the bloodied gash, something began to emerge. At first, it was hard to make out, slick with blood and moving in a way that defied logic. Its limbs twisted unnaturally as it pulled itself free of Emily's body. But as it fully emerged and stood under the dim light of the examination room, its form became all too clear. It had the general shape of a child, but there was nothing human about it. Its limbs were impossibly long and thin, its skin an unnatural pale gray, stretched taut over protruding bones. Its eyes were the worst, massive, black voids that seemed to swallow all the light in the room, their emptiness drilling into my very soul. The pulsing veins that had covered Emily's body were etched into its flesh, faintly glowing with a sickly light. The creature stumbled forward, dripping blood, its movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette yanked by invisible strings. It opened its mouth as if to cry, but no sound came out. Instead, it stared at me, its black, soulless eyes locking onto mine. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was as if those eyes were pulling me into some endless, dark abyss. Dr. Palmer moved closer to it, his arms outstretched as if he were greeting an old friend. "Magnificent," he whispered, his voice trembling with reverence. "Do you see, Mr. Chris? This is the future. This is the next step in evolution, a life form beyond humanity's limits." He turned to me, his tone jubilant, as if expecting me to share in his twisted triumph. "Your child, Emily's child, is the first of its kind." I couldn't speak. I couldn't process the horror standing in front of me. This thing wasn't my child. It couldn't be. This wasn't what we had wanted, what we had fought so hard for. It was a nightmare given form. And then it smiled. Not a human smile, not the innocent smile of a newborn, but something far darker. Far more deliberate. It tilted its head, studying me like I was the experiment, and then its gaze shifted. Slowly, it turned toward Emily's lifeless body on the table. Its elongated fingers reached out, brushing against her still form with an eerie gentleness. "No!" I croaked, my voice barely audible. "Get away from her!" Dr. Palmer didn't even look at me. His focus was entirely on the creature. "There's so much more to be done," he murmured, almost to himself. "So much to learn." I don't remember much after that. The drugs they had injected into me must have taken full effect, because the next thing I knew, I woke up in a hospital bed. The room was blindingly white, sterile, and filled with the low hum of machines. My head throbbed, my body ached, and the weight of everything I'd seen pressed down on me like a boulder. Emily was gone. I didn't need to ask. I felt it in my bones, in the hollow ache in my chest. The creature, the abomination, was gone too. Dr. Palmer, his clinic, everything about that place had vanished, as if it had never existed at all. But the memories remained. The images of that night were seared into my mind, haunting me every time I closed my eyes. That thing, its smile, its black eyes, those memories would stay with me forever. If this was the future, I wanted no part of it. When I asked the nurses and doctors at the hospital about what had happened, they stared at me like I was out of my mind. They told me I had been found unconscious in my apartment, completely alone. There was no sign of Emily, no trace of her anywhere. They claimed there was no clinic, no Dr. Palmer, no record of any fertility treatments. It was as if everything I had experienced had been erased, wiped from reality. But I knew the truth. I knew what I had seen, what had been done to us. The months that followed were a foggy, disjointed blur. I tried desperately to uncover the truth, to retrace my steps and find the clinic, the doctor, anything that could prove what had happened. Every lead I chased evaporated into nothingness. It was as though the entire place had been scrubbed from existence. No records, no staff, no trace of its ever having been there. It was like Emily and I had been part of some secret experiment, buried so deeply that no one could ever find it. Eventually, I couldn't stay in Boston. The city felt haunted, every corner whispering reminders of what I'd lost. I packed my things and left, moving far away to a quiet apartment where I could try, and fail, to leave it all behind. But even here, far from the place where it all happened, I can't escape the nightmares. Every night I see Emily. I see her on that table, her body jerking violently, her face frozen in terror. I hear her screams, raw and desperate, echoing through my mind. And I see it. That thing. That grotesque creature that came from her, a thing that wasn't, and could never be, human. But the worst part, the piece of it all that gnaws at my sanity the most, is knowing that it's still out there. Somewhere, that creature, my child, if I can even call it that, is out in the world. It's walking the earth, growing, learning, evolving. And I can't stop wondering what Dr. Palmer meant when he called it the beginning. What horrors has he unleashed? What other experiments is he conducting, hidden away in the shadows, beyond anyone's reach? I don't think I'll ever find peace. Be careful where you camp in Australia. I've done my fair share of traveling around Australia, and let me tell you, there's no better way to see this incredible country than by car. Sure, you can take a bus, train, or hop from city to city by plane, but you'll miss out on so many hidden gems, those little pockets of paradise you never even know existed. For the most part, my road trips across the country have been unforgettable, filled with great memories. Of course, there have been a few bumps along the way. That's just part of life, isn't it? You take the good with the bad and keep moving forward. That's exactly what I've always done. But one stop still stands out to me, and not in a good way. This particular experience was so unsettling, it almost convinced me to hang up my adventurous hat for good. I'll do my best to recount it. It was late September a few years back, and I was driving from Barrage Bay up to Narooma. If you've never made the trip, it's a stunning coastal drive, with the exception of a short detour inland as you pass Wallaga Lake. One of the best parts of a road trip is the freedom to be spontaneous, especially when you've got a camper van like mine. I could pull over just about anywhere for a break, as long as camping there wasn't against the rules. That's exactly what I did as I wound my way along the curves of that lakeside road. I came across the perfect spot to park for the night, secluded, quiet, and surrounded by nature, just the way I liked it. I set up camp, brewed myself a fresh pot of coffee, and leaned back in my deck chair to soak up the last rays of the day. I'd timed it perfectly, arriving just as the sun was setting. The weather was ideal. September can be warm, but the evenings and early mornings are absolutely perfect for camping. As I stared out at the crystal-clear water, taking in the serenity of the scene, I heard a voice. "Anwaranani!" I jumped, startled. I could have sworn I was completely alone. There wasn't a soul in sight when I arrived. "Anwaranani!" It happened again, the same voice. That's when I realized something that made my skin crawl. The voice wasn't coming from outside. It was inside my head. What the hell? I thought. Maybe I was overtired from the long drive. Then it came again, louder this time. "Anwaranani!" It hit me like a drumbeat inside my skull, a deafening bass note that reverberated through my entire head. The pain was sharp, and I clutched my temples, trying to make it stop. And that's when things got seriously weird. Out of nowhere, 3 kids burst through the tree line behind my camper. They were shouting, waving their arms, and pointing at the road. "Go! Get out of here! Leave now!" They looked to be indigenous kids, maybe from a nearby town or campsite. Don't get me wrong, I don't mean some outdated, stereotypical image of indigenous Australians living in the bush. These were just local kids, but they clearly knew something I didn't. Their urgency, combined with the voice in my head, sent a chill down my spine. I decided it was best to listen. Whatever was going on, I wanted no part of it. I scrambled to pack up my gear and climbed into the driver's seat of the camper. My hands were shaking as I started the engine and switched on the high beams. As soon as the lights pierced the darkness, they illuminated something massive in the bush ahead. It was enormous, easily 12 feet tall, maybe more. Its body was gangly and spider-like, with long limbs sticking out at odd angles. Its face was a pale, unnatural white, and it reminded me of Slender Man, but much worse. Its expression was twisted into a deep scowl, its beady eyes glowing red in the beam of the headlights. Its body was a shadowy, shifting mass, like tar come to life. Then I heard it again, the voice from earlier, but this time, it didn't form words. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl. The kids started pounding on the sides of my camper, shouting frantically. They weren't trying to harm me, they were urging me to leave. Dooligal! Dooligal! They screamed over and over, their voices rising in panic. Then the voice inside my head came again, this time louder than ever, so loud it felt like my brain might split in two. Andwara Nanyi! I watched in frozen horror as this thing slowly pivoted on its right foot, then began an awkward, deliberate shuffle toward my van. It didn't walk normally, it kind of toppled from one short, stumpy leg to the other, moving sideways like a grotesque crab. But its pale white face stayed locked on me the entire time, those angry red eyes narrowing and its twisted expression becoming even more menacing with every step. That was it for me. I was done. My fight-or-flight instincts kicked in, and flight won out. I slammed my foot down on the gas and shot off down the highway. Even as I sped away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror. There it was, still following me, wobbling down the road in that bizarre sideways motion, step by slow, jerky step. Thankfully, it didn't seem capable of moving fast enough to close the distance. As I put more and more miles between us, the thing finally disappeared into the darkness of the night. That was the first, and last, time I've encountered something on my travels that I would call truly otherworldly. I didn't have to search far for answers about what I saw that eerie September night. A simple Google search for the word those kids shouted gave me all the information I needed. Dooligal. According to Wikipedia, the dooligal is a large spider-like creature from Aboriginal Dreamings. Known for its glowing red eyes, it is said to stalk the area around Mount Gulaga. On dark nights, one might catch a glimpse of it, moving sideways across the plains. Where I was camped that night? It was a straight shot south from Mount Gulaga. So yeah, it fit. Why this thing was down by the lakeside instead of sticking to its usual haunt around the mountain, I couldn't say. Maybe it sees all the land surrounding the mountain as its territory. Maybe it was hunting. Who knows? That search led me to investigate something else I heard that night, the words that echoed inside my head over and over. They're from the Gunyandi language, and they roughly translate to, "Please go." What I still can't figure out is whether that voice in my head belonged to the dooligal itself, or if it came from something else entirely. Maybe it was a protector spirit, warning me to leave before it was too late. Because let's face it, nothing about the dooligal seemed friendly or protective. Everything about it, from its menacing gaze to its jerky, sideways shuffle, screamed malevolence. It looked like it wanted to harm me, no doubt about it. And the kids? Their frantic shouting and banging on my van made it clear they were trying to save me. They knew something terrible would happen if I stayed. If it weren't for them, I might not be here to tell this story. But no, I don't believe that voice came from the dooligal. That thing would have been perfectly content to sneak up on me, given half the chance. Still, even now, I can't shake the memory of its bizarre sideways walk. That eerie, lumbering movement as it emerged from the trees remains etched in my mind. This story unfolds in a tiny rural town up in northern Michigan, smack in the dead of January. It's one of those places you wouldn't believe existed unless you were born there, a real blink and you'll miss it kind of spot, with barely 300 folks calling it home. The whole town consists of just a rundown old church, a small convenience store owned by this ancient woman who somehow keeps defying nature, and the local dive bar that's seen better days. You might spot a cop cruising through during daylight hours, but even that's a rare occurrence. People don't move to this town. Most are just itching for a chance to leave. The only reason I stuck around was that I'd inherited my parents' house down a long, dusty dirt road. That night, I was out on the town, if you can call it that, with a few of my buddies celebrating my friend Jake's engagement. The four of us had been roommates back in college, and those days left us with memories that were as wild as they were nostalgic. Jake, the soon-to-be groom, had asked me to be his best man, and I'd already started brainstorming ideas for his bachelor party. We tossed around all sorts of plans, camping in the Upper Peninsula's Hiawatha National Forest, renting an Airbnb in Tennessee, even hitting up the Great Wolf Lodge in Sandusky, Ohio. But reality hit hard. None of us had any vacation time left. So, we decided to keep it simple and head to the local bar. We ate, we drank, and we laughed until our faces hurt. Let me tell you, there's nothing quite like a greasy dive bar burger. It's comfort food at its finest. We swapped stories about Jake, relived the glory days of bachelorhood, and soaked in the warm camaraderie. The bar was nearly empty, save for a few gruff bikers, a cop on their break, and this strange guy eating alone in the corner with his back to the rest of the room. Though none of us were sloshed, we weren't about to risk driving home with alcohol in our systems. Responsibility won out, and we called an Uber to take us to Jake's place. The plan was simple. We'd crash there and grab our cars from the bar the next morning since Jake had come along with me in my car. When the Uber rolled up, there was only space for 3. I volunteered to stay back since my house was just 5 miles away. It was a clear night, I had a heavy coat, and the walk sounded like a nice way to unwind. They protested a dozen times, but I waved them off and told the driver to go. Little did I know, that choice would turn my life upside down. The first leg of the walk was peaceful enough. About 20 minutes in, I'd already covered a mile and was feeling great. The air was crisp, my jacket kept me warm, and I was humming a tune to myself when, bam! Out of nowhere, pain exploded through my body, and I was sent flying like a rag doll. I hit the ground hard, skidding across the asphalt with a sickening scrape. My ears were ringing, and my head felt like it had been spun in circles. When I managed to lift my gaze, I spotted the taillights of a silver sedan. The car slowed for a moment, as if its driver was deciding what to do, but then it sped off into the night. My best guess? They realized I was still alive and didn't want the trouble. Somehow, I was alive. Shaking, I sat up and took stock of my injuries. My arms were raw and scraped to hell, my head throbbed, and my back felt wet, likely from blood. But it was my legs that terrified me. They were twisted into unnatural shapes, and my jeans were soaked with crimson. As the shock started to fade, the pain surged to an intensity one didn't know was possible. Desperation took over. I twisted my body around to scan for help. In the distance, headlights appeared, growing closer with every second. I waved my arms frantically, screaming at the top of my lungs. My heart leapt when the vehicle slowed down. It was a big, 12-passenger van, the kind you'd see at a church outing, with First Baptist Church of Brighton painted on the side in peeling letters. Relief washed over me so fiercely, I started to cry. But when the van got close enough, I caught the driver's eyes. He glared at me with pure disdain, then hit the gas and drove off. I was dumbfounded, screaming and pleading for him to stop, but he vanished into the night. I fumbled for my phone, my last shred of hope. But it was shattered, completely useless. No amount of praying or pleading was going to turn it on. That's when pure survival instincts kicked in. I was closer to the bar than to my house, so I made up my mind to drag myself back there. My hands scraped along the icy road as I inched forward, and the agony was unbearable. The combination of freezing cold and my fingers tearing apart from the friction was pure torment. Blood seeped from under my fingernails, which were peeling back with every painful pull forward. I'd barely made it 30 feet when I noticed headlights coming toward me. The moment I saw those red and blue flashing lights, a wave of relief washed over me, almost as powerful as the moment I held my son for the very first time. The police car slowed as it approached, and the officer rolled his window down. "Officer, what are you doing out here?" "Me. Please, I need help. Someone ran me over and just took off. My legs are broken. I can't move." "Officer, have you been drinking tonight?" "Me. What does that even matter? I need help." "Officer, this town's a dump. Just a bunch of drunks and tweakers." And then he drove off. Just like that. I screamed as loud as I could, yelling and begging for him to come back, but it was no use. He had already decided I wasn't worth the trouble, just another drunken idiot who couldn't handle his liquor. What he didn't know was that I'd only had 2 beers that night, and was the victim of a hit and run. Cops around here? They're hard and jaded, seeing the locals, not just folks like me but the poor souls in the inner cities too, as nuisances rather than people in need. It's all about judgment, not justice. The adrenaline that had kept me going started to wear off, and the bitter cold crept in. I was losing hope fast. No one was going to stop. No one saw me as worth saving. My body gave out, and I closed my eyes, murmuring a desperate prayer. "God, don't let Hannah, don't let my wife, find me like this. Please help Eli, my boy, grow into a strong, good man." I truly thought that was it. My final moment. When I opened my eyes again, I was lying in the back seat of a moving vehicle. Confused, I stirred, trying to figure out what was happening. "Driver. Oh, you're awake back there." I didn't respond right away. "Driver. You're pretty beat up. When I found you, you were mumbling about getting hit by a car?" "Me. Yeah. A hit and run." I explained the whole nightmare, the van full of churchgoers who left me there, the cop who saw me as a lost cause, and the hours I spent in torment. That's when it hit me. I had no idea how long I'd been in this stranger's truck. "Me. Hey, where are we going?" "Driver. Straight to the hospital, man. You don't look great, and there's no time to waste. Could be internal bleeding, brain trauma. Who knows?" Relief washed over me like a wave. "Driver. I've got some ibuprofen if you want something for the pain. It's not much, but it's better than nothing. Hospital's still about 45 minutes out." Desperation clouded my judgment, and I popped the pills without hesitation. I just needed a break from the pain. But within minutes, my eyelids grew heavy, and an uneasy feeling spread through me. Panic gripped me as I sat up and caught a glimpse of the driver in the rearview mirror for the first time. His eyes, they reflected light like an animal's, eerie and unnatural. Then he smiled, and my heart froze. His teeth looked sharp, like needles. My head spun, and my vision blurred as an unbearable weight pulled my eyelids shut. Everything went black. When I woke up again, I was lying in a hospital bed. The room looked pretty standard, just a bed, a small closet, and a door leading to a bathroom. My legs were propped up in a cast, and tubes were hooked into my arm, pumping some clear liquid into my veins. Morphine, maybe? The old tube TV on the wall played reruns of the Andy Griffith Show on loop, and while I didn't know where I was exactly, I knew one thing for sure: the pain was finally under control. That's when I saw him, Graham, the man who picked me up. My heart raced as I hit the nurse call button on the remote over and over again, frantic for help. "Graham. Hey, you good?" He smiled warmly, and this time, his teeth looked normal. just regular teeth. His eyes were a soft, light brown, nothing like the nightmare I remembered. I had to ask. Me. Your teeth, they looked like needles. Graham. What are you even talking about? Me. I saw it in the mirror. Your eyes, they were reflective, and you had hundreds of needle-like teeth. Before he could respond, the doctor walked in. Doctor, you've been through a serious trauma. You suffered a major concussion and lost close to 2 liters of blood. Hallucinations aren't unusual for hit-and-run survivors. That explanation settled me, at least for the moment. I asked if I could use a phone to call my wife, Emma, and let her know what had happened. But the doctor told me that a freak snowstorm had knocked out the phone lines, Wi-Fi, and even the TV service. I glanced out the window and saw the world buried in ice and snow, the storm still raging. How am I able to watch so much Andy Griffith? I asked, gesturing toward the old tube TV in the corner. A nurse chimed in with a smile. We've got a big stash of DVDs, and we figured Andy Griffith was a safe choice for you. The doctor added, the storm's so bad, the staff is staying here too. We've got enough supplies to last a month, so don't worry about a thing. We'll call your wife as soon as the lines are back. For now, just focus on getting better, okay? The first few nights were uneventful. A nurse would come in regularly to reposition me, keeping me from developing bed sores, and they brought me 3 meals a day. The food, though, was strictly plant-based. When I asked for something, anything, with meat or even a glass of milk instead of water, they just smiled apologetically and said they'd run out due to the storm. I wasn't thrilled, but hunger won out, and I ate whatever they brought. Every day, the doctor checked on me, monitoring my progress and drawing a couple of vials of blood each time. Doctor, this is just to keep an eye on things. We don't want you developing any infections or complications. It was after the first week that things started to feel off. The first strange thing was Graham. He came to visit me every single day. At first, I appreciated the gesture. It seemed kind that he'd check on me. But after a while, I found it odd that he was willing to brave the brutal storm every evening to visit. I thought about asking him to find my wife and tell her what had happened, but something in my gut told me that might not be a safe idea. The second strange thing happened late one night. I woke up to the sound of voices outside my door. The doctor and a nurse were talking in hushed tones, but I could still hear them. Doctor, his blood work is nearly perfect. We'll be able to move forward with the treatments soon. Nurse, laughing. Is that what we're calling it now? Treatments? Doctor, he'll do whatever we tell him. We're the experts. Nurse, just keep him grass-fed, and he'll be perfect. The way the doctor said experts made my skin crawl, and that laugh from the nurse, there was something sinister about it. And what did they mean by grass-fed? The word stuck with me, but with all the medications in my system, I convinced myself it was just a bad joke. The real turning point came on the 15th day. I woke with a start to the blaring sound of alarms. Red lights flashed, casting eerie shadows across the room. I could hear frantic shouting in the hallway as nurses and doctors sprinted past, yelling, "Don't let her get out!" I tried to call for someone, anyone, but they ignored me completely. Over the loudspeakers, a female voice barked, "She's outside! North door!" The staff all ran in the same direction, like a stampede, and I could have sworn I caught a glimpse of Graham among them. What was he still doing at the hospital? Before I could make sense of it, a woman burst into my room. She was barefoot, wearing nothing but a hospital gown that clung loosely to her battered frame. Cuts crisscrossed her skin, her hair was tangled, and her wide, wild eyes darted around the room. She was pushing a wheelchair, and before I could even react, she slammed the door behind her. Her. We're getting out of here. Me. Who are you? Her. Irene. Now shut up and get in the chair. Me. Why? What's going on? Why are you running? Irene. Because they're not doctors. Me. What are you talking about? Of course they're doctors. Irene. No, they're not. They're cannibals. Or something worse. Irene. They're fattening us up on a plant-based diet to make us taste better or something. They're going to eat us. Me. You're out of your mind. Irene. Fine, stay here. But I'm getting out. With that, she shoved the wheelchair into the bathroom and darted out of the room, leaving me behind. The alarms blared for a few more minutes. From my bed, I craned my neck to see what was happening and caught sight of a security guard dragging Irene down the hallway, slung over his shoulder in a straitjacket. She thrashed and screamed, her voice breaking. Irene. Please! You have to let me go! They're going to kill me! And then, just as suddenly as it started, the screaming stopped. The doctor walked into my room, looking calm, almost too calm. Doctor. That woman you saw? She's from the psych ward on the top floor. She's been here for months, admitted because she believed she was being stalked by some sort of cannibal cult. Apparently, she managed to steal a nurse's key card and try to escape. Don't worry, it's under control now. His explanation should have put me at ease, but something about the way he delivered it made me uneasy. He looked pleased. Later that night, the nurse brought in my dinner. On the plate was a tiny square of meat. It looked off. The color was a strange reddish purple, and the smell was faint but unappetizing. Nurse. Good news! We found a few beef steaks in the back of the freezer. There wasn't much, so we're rationing it out, a little treat for the patients. I nodded, thanked her, and waited for her to leave before I touched the plate. I couldn't shake Irene's words from my mind. Maybe she was crazy, but this was too much of a coincidence. I glanced out the window. It was still snowing, day 15 of relentless storms. I'd weathered plenty of harsh winters in my life, but this was different. The snow only ever blew in one direction, always to the right. Never left. It was odd. Unnatural. I threw the meat square into the trash, my appetite completely gone, and turned over in bed to try to sleep. The next morning, the doctor came in to cut off my cast and examine my progress. Doctor. Your right leg is healing nicely, but your left leg, it looks like your body is rejecting the plates and screws. Unfortunately, we'll need to schedule an amputation at the hip. Me. Amputation? Are you sure? My leg feels fine. Doctor. I'm afraid there's no other option. Between Irene's outbursts, the strange meat, the bizarre storm, and now the sudden talk of amputation, I knew I had to get out of there. They fitted me with a new cast, but only on my right leg. My left leg was marked for amputation. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some kind of trap. I decided then and there to plan my escape. I had one usable leg, so I figured I could endure the pain long enough to reach the wheelchair. I'd have to work fast. Between blood checks and meal deliveries, I'd have a short window to get out of bed, stage a decoy, and slip away unnoticed. It was a risky plan, but I wasn't going to let them take my leg. That night, during the blood check, I managed to pocket the small knife that came with my food tray and hide it inside my cast. After the nurse left, I set to work. At 5 a.m., when the staff usually left me undisturbed, I made my move. Using the knife, I hacked off most of my hair and beard, fashioning a crude decoy. I stuffed the pillows under the blanket, arranging them to mimic my body, and placed the clump of hair where my head would be. When I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, pain shot through me like lightning, but I gritted my teeth and forced myself to stand. My legs wobbled under the strain, but I managed a few agonizing steps to the bathroom. When I opened the door, I expected a typical hospital bathroom, a toilet, a sink, maybe a shower. But the room was empty except for the wheelchair in the corner. No plumbing, no fixtures, just bare walls. It didn't make any sense. Why wasn't there a bathroom here? I ignored the unsettling detail and climbed into the wheelchair. Rolling quietly to the door, I positioned myself behind it and peered through the crack. The hallway was eerily silent. At the nurse's station, one nurse sat with her back to me, typing something into the computer. I checked the clock on the wall. 10 minutes had passed since I'd started. I took a deep breath, steadied my hands, and wheeled into the hallway, moving as quietly as I could. To my right, I spotted the exit sign. Was I on the first floor? I couldn't say, and honestly it didn't matter at the moment. I wheeled past the nurse's station, gliding by a row of empty rooms. My heart was pounding in my chest as I heard voices coming from the break room. Doctor. His leg's coming off first thing in the morning. Graham. About time. I've been waiting too long for a taste of that meat. Doctor. You really messed him up when you hit him with the car. Our van driver and the cop thought he'd died before we even got him here. Graham. Hey, I was just doing what I was told. Hit the guy and move on. It's not like I want to risk getting caught by a real cop. I'd much rather be one of you doctors than a driver. My mind reeled. Graham hit me? The church van was part of this. Even the cop? It all started to click into place, but there was no time to process. The alarm blared, louder and more urgent than ever. Voice over intercom. He's not in his room. I panicked and pushed myself to wheel faster. The exit was just ahead. My arms burned, my breathing was erratic, and tears blurred my vision, but I kept going. As I burst through the double doors, I glanced back, and froze in disbelief. It wasn't a hospital. It was a massive warehouse. The snow on the ground wasn't piled high as I'd thought, just a thin 3-inch layer. And the storm? Manufactured. Fans mounted on tall poles churned out fake snow, creating the illusion of a relentless blizzard. 16 days of storming had been nothing but a facade. I scanned the parking lot. There they were, the silver sedan, the church van, the cop car, and Graham's truck. My stomach churned. It was all part of the same nightmare. I wheeled to the cop car. No keys. The sedan? No keys. Graham's truck? Nothing. Finally, by some miracle, the keys were still in the ignition of the church van. Voice from behind. There he is! Don't let him escape! Adrenaline surged through me as I climbed out of the wheelchair, wincing with every step. My hospital gown whipped in the cold wind as I forced myself into the driver's seat and turned the key. Screet. C-U-N-K. 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 It wouldn't start. Screet. C-U-N-K. 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 I tried again, panic rising in my throat. Screet. Brum. 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 The engine roared to life. Just as I hit the gas, the passenger door flew open. Graham jumped in. His eyes reflected the light like an animal's. His mouth stretched into a sick grin, revealing those same needle-like teeth. Graham, you've really messed up this time, buddy. He lunged, grabbing me with terrifying strength, and in one swift motion, he threw me into the back of the van. He climbed back, laughing as he hovered over me. Graham, I've got to give it to you, you almost got away. I'm impressed. Then he attacked. His fists came down like sledgehammers, and I was helpless against his raw power. Every hit felt like it would be my last. My body was weak from the low-protein diet, the medications, and my injured legs. Then I remembered the knife in my cast. As Graham bared his sharp teeth and leaned in toward my neck, I reached for the blade. With all the strength I had left, I drove the knife into his eye. His scream was unearthly, reverberating through the van as he staggered back. I didn't wait. I crawled out of the van and fell onto the cold ground. The first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, painting the eastern sky in gold. I dragged myself forward, inch by agonizing inch, just like I had the night of the hit and run. Behind me, Graham leapt from the van, holding the knife in one hand, his eyeball dangling from the blade. He stormed toward me on all fours, his mouth twisted in rage. But then he froze. A single beam of sunlight hit his hand, and his skin began to sizzle and smoke. He roared, stumbling back, and then darted into the woods like a wild animal. That was the last I ever saw of Graham. I managed to drive the van to the nearest police station, the Beltrami County Sheriff's Department in Minnesota. I told them everything, the hit and run, the fake hospital, my escape. They didn't believe a word of it. Still, they helped me arrange a flight back home to Michigan. I never heard from anyone about the warehouse again, and I never went looking for answers. I was just grateful to be home. So if you're ever tempted to walk home in some quiet little town, do yourself a favor, wait for the next Uber.